There is a clock radio on a nightstand in northwest Portland, and for 40 years it is the only witness that matters. On July 24th, 1979, a 20-year-old woman named Anna Marie Hlavka came home from her shift at McDonald's, walked into her apartment on Northwest Couch Street, and never left it alive. The man who killed her would be dead himself for 20 years before anyone said his name in connection to her murder. He would never sit in a courtroom for what he did to her. He would never hear a verdict. And yet, in the end, he was found not because he confessed, not because a witness came forward, but because science eventually caught up to a crime that had outrun it for 4 decades. This is that story. Before we go further, if you're watching this, let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. It helps more than you'd think. Portland, in the summer of 1979, was a city that still felt, in a lot of ways, like a smaller town than it was. It's worth saying plainly, we don't have detailed accounts of how this particular Northwest Portland neighborhood felt about safety that year, whether people locked their doors out of habit or ignored it entirely, whether this stretch near downtown had a reputation as sleepy or transitional. What we do know is the shape of the apartment building itself, described later by reporters as a modest brick building just northwest of downtown Portland, the kind of place that housed young people starting out, sharing rent, building the first version of an adult life. Anna Marie Hlavka was one of them. She was 20 years old. She worked at a McDonald's nearby, the kind of job that so many people her age held then and hold now. A paycheck, a routine, a reason to be somewhere 5 days a week. She lived in the apartment with her sister, Rose Ann, and with her boyfriend, who by most accounts was also her fiancé. They were, as far as the record shows, talking about getting married. Police who spoke with people who knew her afterward used a simple phrase to describe her: a well-mannered young lady. It isn't a long description, it isn't a detailed one, but it's the kind of phrase people reach for when someone was quietly, unremarkably kind. The sort of person whose absence would be immediately, physically felt by the people around her. On the evening of July 24th, she was seen outside her apartment building around 5 o'clock, having just come home from work. That is the last confirmed sighting of Anna Marie Hlavka alive. Later that night, close to 10 o'clock, her sister Rose Ann came home. She was expecting, as anyone would be after a long day, to walk into an apartment with her sister in it, maybe the television on, maybe dinner half made, maybe nothing more remarkable than an ordinary Tuesday night. Instead, Rose Ann found her sister dead. We don't have Rose Ann's own words about that moment. No interview, no quote, nothing on the record describing what it was like to open that door. That silence is its own kind of detail. Some griefs never make it into a police report or a news clipping. They just live in a person, for the rest of their life, unrecorded. What the evidence showed was this: Anna Marie had been sexually assaulted, and she had been strangled with the cord from her own clock radio. It is a detail that is hard to sit with precisely because of how ordinary the object was. A clock radio is not a weapon. It sits on a nightstand and it wakes you up in the morning. That it became the instrument of her death says something about the nature of the crime itself. Sudden, opportunistic, using whatever was within reach. Whoever did this left behind something else too, without knowing it. A DNA profile. Unknown, unidentified, and as it would later turn out, unusually well preserved for evidence that would sit for decades before anyone could fully use it. In 1979, DNA evidence, as we understand it today, did not exist as an investigative tool. The technology to take a biological sample and turn it into a name was still years away. Investigators in 1979 could collect evidence. They could not yet read it. What they had was a case with almost no leads, a young woman without an apparent connection to anyone dangerous, and a killer who had left the scene without a trace anyone could immediately follow. Here is where the record gets thin, and it's worth being honest about that rather than filling the silence with invented drama. We don't have detailed documentation of the original 1979 investigation, who led it, what leads were chased in the first days and weeks, whether anyone was wrongly suspected along the way. What we know is that the case went cold, not abandoned exactly, but unsolved, sitting in a file. waiting on a technology that hadn't been invented yet. That wait would last 30 years. In 2009, retired detectives submitted the old evidence to the state crime lab for renewed forensic testing. It was a small, almost administrative act, the kind of thing that happens in police departments across the country, cases getting a second look as technology improves. In 2011, that testing paid off in one specific way. The unknown male DNA profile from the 1979 crime scene was finally isolated and usable. But a DNA profile alone doesn't solve a case. It only tells you that you're looking for someone specific, not who that someone is. Between 2012 and 2016, detectives collected DNA from 8 separate individuals, each one a possible suspect, each one submitted for comparison against the crime scene profile. All 8 came back negative. 8 people cleared, 8 dead ends, 4 more years gone, and the case was, in every practical sense, right back where it had been in 2011. A name-shaped hole with no name to fill it. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it's easy to compress. 8 suspects is not a quick process. Each one represents months of work, locating someone, building a reason to suspect them, obtaining a sample, waiting on lab results, and then starting over. By 2016, this case had been technically active for 7 years and had produced nothing but a growing list of people who hadn't done it. Meanwhile, the ordinary machinery of a cold case kept running in the background. CODIS AOSOG, the FBI's national DNA database, the tool that has cracked open thousands of cold cases by matching crime scene DNA against profiles of convicted offenders, had nothing to offer here. The profile from Anna Marie's case had been run against it. No match. And there was a structural reason for that, one nobody investigating the case could have known at the time. The man who killed her was already dead, and he had died before his DNA was ever entered into the system that might have caught him. By 2016, this case was as cold as it had been in 1979. Colder in some ways, because now the leads had run out entirely rather than simply never having been found. Then, in the spring of 2018, something happened in another state that would change everything about how this case could be approached. In April of that year, investigators in California announced the arrest of the Golden State Killer, a man responsible for a string of rapes and murders across the state decades earlier, identified not through CODIS, but through a method almost nobody outside a small circle of genealogists and hobbyists had heard of: forensic genetic genealogy. Instead of matching DNA against a database of criminals, investigators had matched it against public genealogy websites, the same kind of sites ordinary people use to build family trees, and worked backward from distant relatives to a name. The following month, in May of 2018, Portland detectives began looking into whether this same method could be applied to their own backlog of unsolved cases. Anna Marie Hlavka's file was one of them. Detectives reached out to Parabon Nanolabs and to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab, asking a simple question: was this DNA profile a strong enough candidate for genetic genealogy work? The answer was yes. The crime scene DNA was submitted to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database not built for law enforcement, but open enough that investigators could use it the same way any person searching for long-lost relatives might. Here's what makes this kind of work feel less like a lab procedure and more like detective work. A genealogist doesn't get a name handed to them. They get a list of people who share some DNA with the unknown profile: third cousins, fourth cousins, people who may never have heard of Anna Marie Hlavka or Portland, Oregon in their lives. From there, the work is almost archaeological, building family trees backward and forward, cross-referencing birth records and marriage records and obituaries, looking for the place where multiple family lines might intersect in a single person. In this case, the genealogist working the file was able to map 3 of the 4 family lines descending from the unknown DNA contributor. 3 out of 4 is enough when the work is done carefully to narrow an entire family tree down to one plausible name. That name was Jerry Walter McFadden. Detectives Meredith Hopper and Brendan McGuire, working the case for the Portland Police Bureau's Cold Case Unit, now had somewhere to look. And what they found when they started digging into McFadden's history connected almost too neatly to the timeline of Anna Marie's murder. McFadden had been paroled in Texas in December of 1978, released after serving time for 2 counts of rape, just 8 months before Anna Marie was killed. And detectives learned that in 1979, McFadden had traveled to the Pacific Northwest with an acquaintance, a woman who later told police she had dropped him off in Portland and had no further contact with him after that. To confirm what the genealogy pointed toward, detectives traveled to Texas and interviewed members of McFadden's family, collecting DNA samples for direct familial comparison. The Oregon State Police Crime Lab compared those samples against the crime scene profile from 1979. It matched. Honestly, without this technology, we would have never solved this case, Detective Hopper would later say. It is a simple sentence, and it carries the weight of 30 years of dead ends behind it. But there would be no trial, no sentencing hearing, no moment where Jerry Walter McFadden stood in a Portland courtroom and answered for what he did to Anna Marie Hlavka. Because by the time his name surfaced in connection to her case, he had already been dead for almost 20 years, executed for crimes he committed years after leaving Oregon. What McFadden did after 1979 explains why. Later that same year, he was convicted of kidnapping and raping an 18-year-old woman at knife point. He was paroled again in July of 1985. Less than a year later, in May of 1986, he kidnapped 3 young people near Lake Hawkins in East Texas: Gina Turner, 20, Brian Boone, 19, and Suzanne Harrison, 18. He raped and killed Harrison, leaving her body some 25 miles from where he'd taken her. Boone and Turner were found days later, both killed with a firearm. He was arrested on May 6, 1986, after a separate couple he had attacked near the same lake reported him to police. But in July of that year, McFadden overpowered a jailer, took a corrections officer hostage, and escaped from the Upshur County Jail. What followed has been described as the largest manhunt in Texas history, more than 1,000 officers searching for him, with McFadden holding his hostage for 3 days while evading capture. He was eventually found barefoot and scratched, hiding in the bathroom of an abandoned house near Big Sandy, Texas. He was convicted of capital murder for Suzanne Harrison's killing in 1987 and sentenced to death. His appeals were denied. On October 14, 1999, Jerry Walter McFadden, known by the nickname The Animal, was executed by lethal injection. He was 51 years old. At the time of his execution, routine entry of executed inmates' DNA into CODIS was not yet universal practice. His profile was never entered into the system, which means that for nearly 20 years after his death, the one tool most likely to catch a killer like him, a national DNA database, simply had nothing to check against. He was, in the most literal sense, invisible to the system built to find people like him. It took a different kind of search entirely, one built on family trees instead of criminal records, to finally connect him to Anna Marie Hlavka. On January 31, 2019, the Portland Police Bureau announced that Anna Marie's murder had been solved. Nearly 40 years after she died, a name finally existed where there had only been an unknown profile. There was no arrest to make, no hearing to attend. The case closed not with a verdict, but with an identification, a strange kind of resolution where the family finally has an answer, but never gets to see the person responsible held to account in the way they might have imagined for 40 years. We don't have on-the-record reflections from Roseanne Hlavka or other family members about what it meant to finally learn a name. That's a gap in the public record, not a detail left out for pacing. Some things about this case simply weren't documented anywhere available, and it feels more honest to say so than to invent a scene that never happened. What this case did leave behind is a template, not for storytelling, but for investigation. It stands now as one of the clearer examples of what genetic genealogy can do that a standard DNA database cannot. Solve a case where the offender died before ever being entered into the system built to catch him. Investigators have since wondered whether McFadden may be connected to other unsolved crimes, given the unexplained stretch of time he spent in Oregon in 1979 and the multi-state span of his known history. That question remains open. If there's something practical to take from a case like this one, it isn't a list of generic safety tips. It's a little more specific than that. It's a reminder that evidence preserved carefully, even when the technology to use it doesn't exist yet, can still matter decades later. Departments that invest in proper evidence storage are effectively investing in future justice they can't yet imagine. It's a reminder that a cold case is not the same as a closed case, that renewed interest, even 30 years later, can still move a file forward. And it's a reminder that new tools, like genetic genealogy, don't just solve new crimes. They go backward into cases everyone assumed had run out of road. Anna Marie Hlavka was 20 years old. She worked at a McDonald's. She was planning a wedding. She was, in the words of the people who knew her, well-mannered. A small, plain word that somehow says everything about the kind of ordinary, unremarkable life that was taken from her on a summer evening in 1979. It took 40 years, 2 states, and a technology nobody could have imagined at the time of her death. But eventually, her name and his were connected permanently on the public record for anyone to see. If this story mattered to you, consider sharing it. Cases like Anna Marie's stay solved because people keep telling them. Thank you for watching.